Hi, everyone. I'm Amnon Lehavi. I'm the co-president of the Law School's Global League, together with Professor Gonzalo Matias. It's my absolute privilege to say a few words at the opening of this conference organized by the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And let me just express my deep gratitude to Vladislav Starzenitsky, who is the Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law, and to Yana Vichkanova for all her hard work in making this happen. And of course, first and foremost, to the two co-organizers of this event, Dr. Daria Boklan from HSC and Dr. Amrita Bari from ITAM in Mexico. It's really, yesterday we held the Dean's meeting, where we had deans and other representatives from 27 out of the 31 members of the law schools, including our most recent addition, Strathmore University in Kenya. And it was wonderful to see everybody being able to join us on Zoom. You know, technology and even the challenges of the pandemic can also bring opportunities. And it is this event today which is the highlight of the summer events of the Law Schools Global League, the 3R initiative, Rethinking, Repackaging, and Rescuing World Trade Law Conference. So for those of you who join us and are not regularly a part of the Law Schools Global League, let me just say that the league was established in 2012. It brings together 31 member law schools, leading law schools from all over the world, each one engaged in the study of law and globalization. And we came together almost 10 years ago to think and work together about the impacts of globalization on law and the legal practice. So we collaborate on research and we have various working groups. And in fact, this conference is the result of a relatively new established working group led by Amrita, Daria, and Vladislav about international trade and investment law. So this relatively young working group, which was established, I think, in Stockholm 2 years ago, is very active, is very prominent, and is organizing today's event. So I'm really blessed with the opportunity that you give us as the organizers and leaders of this working group to bring forward this wonderful conference. We also collaborate on teaching and pedagogy. And in fact, this is the first week of our online summer school. And we have the students who take part in the course offered by Amrita Bari and Michel Raton Sanchez Badin from FGV in Brazil, who are teaching a class on trade and investment in times of disruption. And once again, this is a wonderful opportunity from about 50 students from all over the world to attend a course about a very timely issue. And I'm very happy about the fact that the students are joining us today. Finally, what the league does is outreach to the legal profession and outreach to the industry. And I'm absolutely delighted with the fact that we have with us today representatives from the World Trade Organization, from the United Nations, from the Diplomatic Corps. This is really what we want to do as law school. We want to reach out to the legal profession. Finally, let me just say that we will report live about this event on Facebook and Twitter. We have with us Ezra Ozkan from Koch University, who will take care of reporting in real time on Twitter and Facebook. And actually, I would be happy to put in the chat box the Facebook and Twitter handles. So please follow us on Facebook and Twitter. And I congratulate you and I wish you the best of luck in this important conference. And Amrita, Daria, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Amnon, for this very, very kind introduction of our group and our activities. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, dear colleagues. So we are very glad to welcome you at this conference. This year, we're all experiencing different challenges to our professional activities, including online conferences. And I regret very much that we cannot welcome you at High School of Economics in Moscow, providing you with coffee, with Russian cuisine, and at lunch. And online conferences, they do not give such a possibility, and everyone is responsible himself or herself for serving, yes, coffee and lunch. But on the other hand, I'm very glad that we've managed to organize this 3R initiative, and during the nearest 7 hours, we'll together try to rethink, repackage, and rescue not the whole world, but at least world trade. And the best person to start this initiative is our keynote speaker. And let me introduce the person who doesn't need introduction, but I have to do it formally, Professor Peter van den Bosch, who is Director of Studies of the World Trade Institute and Professor of International Economic Law in University of Bern. He's President of Society of International Economic Law. Peter van den Bosch is a former member and chairman of the appellate body. And on top of that, as Amrita already mentioned, he's the author of the book, The Whole World Studies the WTO. So like a Bible of the WTO, we all study, read from the very beginning to the very end. We are very happy and grateful and honored to have Professor Peter van den Bosch as a keynote speaker at our conference. The title of his keynote lecture is Will the WTO Survive COVID-19, Economic Nationalism and Superpower Confrontation? So with a great pleasure, I'm giving now the floor to Professor Peter van den Bosch.
You have to unmute. Thank you very much, Daria. You succeeded in making a 60-year-old blush with your introduction. You're far too kind. But let me start perhaps by thanking the Law School's Global League and the Higher School of Economics Moscow for this most appreciated invitation. If we now go to my presentation, I think we should.
Yes.
We should all be there, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. As Daria already said, I will be talking about the WTO. Whether the WTO, or let me say, whenever I talk about the WTO, I'm really talking also about the multilateral trading system. Let that be clear. Yeah? But whether the WTO will survive the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it will survive this wave of economic nationalism that we're currently experiencing and that we have been experiencing for a number of years already, and survive the return of superpower confrontation. This time, not so much between the Soviet Union and the United States, but between China and the United States. What I would like to do with you is, first of all, have a look at international trade today, July 2020. How bad is it? And secondly, look at the causes of the crisis at the WTO, or the causes of the crisis of the multilateral trading system. Third, what kind of responses did we have to this crisis so far? And then finally, and you will allow me to look into my crystal ball to talk a bit about the title of the conference, at least the title of my lecture, namely, Will the WTO Survive? Let's first have a look at the international trade landscape today. And it's clear that the COVID-19 pandemic has causes, and I'm sorry to say will continue to cause an unprecedented disruption of the global economy and of international trade. The IMF, in its June update, predicts that the global economy in 2020 will shrink by almost 5%. And today, a couple of hours ago, the UN predicts that 260 million people will face starvation this year. This is information that we were given today. In April, the WTO predicted that international trade in 2020 would decrease between 13% and 32%. Now, in June, they came out with a prediction saying that it's more likely to be to the lower side of that range than to the 32% worst case scenario. But even if it is the most positive scenario that the WTO could think of, the 13% decline, that would be unprecedented. What kind of responses have we seen to the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, obviously in the first place, lockdowns. Many countries have gone in lockdown, have placed their economies in lockdown. Many countries are now coming out of that lockdown, totally or partially. And I think as all of you, I ask myself whether it's not too soon in many of these countries. Countries have taken or adopted export restrictions and prohibition. The WTO calculated that about 80 countries had imposed such restrictions and prohibitions on obviously medical equipment, masks, shields, face masks, face shields, pharmaceuticals, medical machinery such as ventilators, but also foodstuffs and even toilet paper. And I'm still waiting for the first person to explain to me why you have export restrictions and prohibitions on toilet paper. What we have also seen is massive support to domestic industry. Many countries, and on the internet you can find complete lists, country by country, of all the support measures, read subsidies, that national governments have given to protect, to help their domestic industry. Today, the European Council meets to discuss, among other things, but it's very high on the agenda, to discuss the European Commission's proposal for an aid package, COVID support package of $750 billion spread out over the next few years, but that is an unprecedented aid effort on the part of the European Union. It remains to be seen to how much the European Union leaders will agree, but the proposal is on the table. We've also seen restrictions on foreign direct investments. And finally, and in a way, this is perhaps the most worrisome thing, because the lockdowns are passing out. The export restrictions, actually, many of them are already withdrawn by now. The massive support, the subsidies, where we will have to live with. Restrictions on foreign direct investment, well, some of them may be overdue, at least control over some of the investments made. The most worrisome thing is perhaps that in response to the COVID crisis, there has been a surge of advocacy among politicians, but also in the public opinion at large, for self-sufficiency, for reshoring of manufacturing, for decoupling from global value chains. Now, I talked to you about the predictions of the WTO in terms of the development of trade. And you can see in green the optimistic scenario, in red the pessimistic scenario. And these were the scenarios put to us in April. In June, the WTO told us that it's more likely to be closer to the green line. But I think even the green line is overly optimistic in the sense of the recovery that you see indicated here. It's like a V. Huh? Bear with me, remember this. On the next slide, I will make the point that it's unlikely going to be that V, that we will see a rapid improvement of the situation in 2021, 2022. The other thing that I want to point out to you in preparation of my next slide is just have a look at the end of the blue line. Yeah, the end of the blue line was already going flat. That's 2019. And the flat was not really flat, as I will now illustrate. International trade is clearly in a deep, deep crisis as a result of COVID. But already pre-COVID, yeah, at a time that nobody of us had heard of social distancing, yeah, or, well, perhaps we had heard of it, but considered it to be uncivil behavior. Huh? Before the COVID crisis, international trade was already in trouble. If you look at the 2019 numbers, trade in goods was down by 3%. And trade in services only grew in 2019 by a paltry 2%. That was much, much lower than the previous years. So there was already, trouble was already there. If you read this year's report, EU report on trade and investment barriers, the report that deals with 2019, what does the European Commission say there? The European Commission says two things, and I'm just taking two quotes out of, not out of context, but out of the report. The first quote is that there has been a worrying sea change, so an enormous change in world trade. That world trade is no longer as it used to be. And secondly, there's a statement that protectionism has become deeply ingrained in global trade. This is the European Commission speaking. Pre-COVID, it's not talking about 2020, it's talking about 2019, before the COVID crisis hit us. Now, what are the causes of this crisis, this pre-COVID crisis? First of all, obviously, weak economic growth worldwide. Yeah. But secondly, and you can't go around that, the crisis of the WTO and the multilateral trading system. And I'll talk more about that crisis in the rest of my lecture. So that crisis was already there. And it's because we have that crisis of the WTO and the multilateral trading system that the impact, let me reformulate that. That crisis will have an impact on the recovery of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will not see what we saw after the 2008, 2009 global financial crisis, where we did indeed see a decline, but then a quick recovery. In 2020, 2021, we were again at previous levels. So the recovery was very quickly at that time. And the reason for that quick recovery was to a large extent because we had, although we criticized it at the time, but we had a well-functioning WTO, we had a well-functioning multilateral trading system. We don't have that now. So don't expect that quick recovery. All right, let's now look at the causes of the current crisis. And I'm trying to move here a bar on my screen that prevents me from seeing everything. Okay. The causes of the crisis at the WTO. And now I have a problem with the next slide. Okay, solved. Let me start by saying, beware of US bashing. Yeah. Yes. Let me start with that statement, because I think that there are multiple causes to the current crisis, and we all bear part of the responsibility. All of us, all countries. So beware of US bashing, but the fundamental shift in US trade policy under the Trump administration is undoubtedly the prime cause of the current crisis. The United States has evolved from the champion of trade liberalization, from the country that for many years, actually since 1947, since the conclusion of since the start of the GATT, has been pushing trade liberalization and has paid the price for that. They've been willing, on more than one occasion, to sacrifice short-term gains for long-term objectives. That's what you also expect a leader of a system to do. They did. And they did that for a very long time. They were champions, the champion of trade liberalization. They've evolved into what I unfortunately cannot but call the demolisher-in-chief of the multilateral trading system. Just to illustrate this with a few examples, or just by pointing your attention to things that you're all familiar with, but US trade policy actions since 2017, so since the Trump administration came to power. First of all, there was the withdrawal from or the renegotiation of important trade agreements. Think of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they decided to leave. Then to find out, to their surprise and horror probably, that the other partners in that agreement went on and concluded the, what is it called, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Good on them, to show that it is possible to make progress without the United States. The United States withdrew from that agreement. I never understood why. Because if the TPP was anything, it was an anti-China agreement. It was a coalition of countries to put some limits on the expansion of the influence of China in the region. Well, you explain me why the Trump administration withdrew from that one. Another thing that we've seen is the change from NAFTA to the USMCA. And I leave it to my economist friends to explain whether that is really a sea change that President Trump promised, or whether it was primarily cosmetics that President Trump was able to sell to the United States people as being a big success. Secondly, we've seen a reckless, and if I could underline, I would underline reckless invocation of the national security exception to restrict imports, even imports from allies. And we're thinking here of obviously steel and aluminium. Yeah? But continued threats to do the same for cars and car parts. Yeah, this is a lecture in its own right. So let's go on. What else? What else have we seen? Well, perhaps I should have started with that one. Yeah, the trade war with China. To trigger the trade war to China, and the trade war affecting $350 billion of Chinese goods and $110 billion of US goods. Now, I don't know about you, but I can think in millions. Not that I have them, but I can think in millions. But I can't think in billions. Honestly, that is above my. So let me perhaps tell you about this trade war in the following way. Yeah. Now, these are. This comes, by the way, I hope that I've mentioned this somewhere. No, I forgot. This is from Chad Baum from the Peterson Institute, International Economics. So these are not mine, they're his. But I'm a great admirer of Chad, so I always like to use his material. But this time I forgot to mention that it's his. Anyway, look at January 2018. That's not that long ago. Yeah, you may even remember what you were doing then. Yeah? January 2018, the average tariff rate on Chinese products coming into the United States was 3.1%. Economists usually say that that's a nuisance. It's not really a barrier to trade. It's a nuisance. Yeah. And now, of course, there were peaks. And this is the average rate. But let's continue to think in average rates. Yeah? If you go to March 2020, and that's still the reality today, yeah? The average rate was 19.3%. 19.3. Now, I'm a lawyer and I'm not very good at maths, but that is many, many times more than where we started as recent as January 2018. Now, you'll also see the increase, the retaliatory increase of Chinese average tariff rates. And some of you may think, yes, Professor, but what about the phase one trade deal? That deal is calculated in these statistics already. The situation would have been far worse when that trade deal, which, by the way, also due to the COVID crisis, is now in shatters. Chad Baum actually recently calculated that the Chinese had only fulfilled 50% of their promises in that under that agreement. So that phase one trade deal merely prevented the crisis to further escalate. It has not. So I hope this is a clearer presentation and talk about billions and billions of dollars of goods, just the increase in average tariff rate. What else have we seen in US trade policy? Well, we've seen, and admire the picture on top of your screen, we have seen the paralysis of the appellate body due to the refusal of the United States to even start the process of appointing or reappointing appellate body members. So from 7, we went, I shouldn't say we anymore, but the appellate body went down to 1, and which made it inoperational, paralyzed. And that has, but that again is a lecture in its own right, that has a devastating, in my opinion, devastating impact on the whole WTO dispute settlement system. We have also seen repeated threats of the United States, and in particular of President Trump, who tweets about these things. Threats to leave the WTO, unless it reforms and rewrites its rules. Rewrites its rules to the liking of the United States. Rules, by the way, that they have written themselves, yeah, to a large extent, but that apparently are no longer convenient. For the longest time, I did not take this threat very seriously, and I still don't take it very seriously, but we've seen them leave the World Health Organization. Yeah. And yeah, what can, yeah. But remember that I started by saying beware of US bashing. So let me point out that the blame is wider spread. Yeah, the blame for the crisis the worldwide rise in anti-globalism and economic nationalism is to be seen everywhere. And I'll try to dissect it in a number of elements. First of all, there has been, in many countries, in some it's less pronounced than in others, but there has been a rise and emergence of populist politics, catering to the needs of the losers of globalization and international trade. You all know, and you've been taught, that international trade has losers as well as winners among countries, but even more so within countries. There are those that benefit from international trade, from economic globalization. There are those that lose out. As a society as a whole, we benefit. Yeah? But within societies, there are groups that lose out. These groups have, not only in the United States, but in quite a number of other countries too, have been given a voice. And in some countries, even as in the United States, political power by populist politicians. And this is not going to go away soon. Secondly, there is now, our international politics are defined by the US-China superpower confrontation. And the way in which the United States reacts to that confrontation by pursuing a strategy of containment. And this is not limited to trade. This you see in many other fields too. But that superpower confrontation, which obviously has had an effect on US trade policy, we've talked about that just a minute ago, but it also has had an impact on trade policies worldwide. Countries have to some extent already chosen sides in the US-China confrontation. Other countries, and now I'm referring to the European Union, have beefed up their trade remedies arsenal, their trade weapons arsenal considerably, and are in the process of doing that. Yeah. Three. Not four in total, but this is number 3. There has been, and I'm actually quite sympathetic to this. Yeah, so it's not all bad. Well, the rising anti-globalism and economic nationalism is bad, but I'm sympathetic for the ever-mounting concern regarding the social and environmental sustainability of economic growth and international trade. And in a way, it goes back to the first point, because the social sustainability has much to do with income disparity that has been growing and growing and growing in many countries. to an unsustainable level. Yeah? So that also explains a worldwide rise in anti-globalism and economic nationalism. And this is something, already looking forward to later slides, this is something that we will have to address, just as we will have to address the other two, but we'll have to address these concerns, and we'll have to address them better than we've done so far. And then finally, and that goes back to the COVID crisis, I think the COVID experience has made many think that there's an unacceptable dependency on trade. And as I already noted before, this then gives the idea of reshoring manufacturing, decoupling from the global value chain. This is something that is also at the source of a wave of anti-globalism and economic nationalism. Now, what have been the responses so far? Well, first of all, I perhaps by way of introduction, say something that is obvious to all of you, but that is actually a new development. The crisis now is an that should be encompassing, all-encompassing crisis. In the sense that, and that was already there for quite some time, that we have an unsuccessful negotiating function at the WTO. I always want to put a footnote there by saying that the WTO has not been a complete failure as a negotiating forum. Yeah? We have seen a second, a renewed information technology agreement. We have seen an updated global procurement agreement, global, not government procurement agreement. We have obviously, should have perhaps raised that first. We have seen the trade facilitation agreement. There has been a ban on agricultural export subsidies. There has been, some in Washington would not agree on that being a negotiating success, but I think it was. We've seen the successful negotiation of the accession protocol with China and with Russia. Yeah. Looking back at these things, they were not obvious that agreements could be reached, especially with China. They were reached. So, okay, I'm spending too much on saying that it was to some extent successful. Let's focus on the fact that it's not successful, the negotiating function, because that is indeed part of the crisis, an important part of the crisis. Secondly, and that is new, we are faced with a damaged dispute settlement function. And I say that's new because until quite recently, WTO dispute settlement system was the jewel in the crown of the WTO. Yeah? And people didn't even laugh when you said that. Yeah? Well, I mean, yes, the shine of the jewel was perhaps a little bit less than it was a few years before, but it still was very much the jewel in the crown. It was the thing that worked and that worked well. Well, no longer. And then finally, and this is also relatively new because we thought that was, well, we knew that there was a problem with notification, but we were not troubled too much about this. The deficient monitoring function. So the crisis of the WTO, these being the three principal crises, is an all-encompassing crisis. Now, fortunately, there's a broad recognition that the WTO needs reform. You know? The worst situation in which we could be, and fortunately we're not, is that countries would deny that we're in a crisis, would think that nothing needed to be changed. I think there's a broad recognition that the WTO needs reform. And a famous statement, of which I just take out one sentence, which I like to cite in this context, is that in September 2018, the then Trade Commission, EU Trade Commission, Cecilia Malmström, said, the world has changed. The WTO has not, and that's a problem. Yeah? And I think she said that very well. Yeah? And I think many countries, if not all countries, all members of the WTO recognize that something has to change. Now, what has to change? There the opinions differ, huh? And they differ very much. And how much needs to be changed? Yeah, so think to what needs to be changed. But never before there have been so many papers, so many proposals on the table as the last 2 years and a half on the reform of the WTO. It pains me a bit to say, but this is perhaps the only positive thing that comes out of the US's attitude to the multilateral trading system. The fact that they said we're not playing anymore in this system, that's saying too much, huh? But we contest the system, we want it changed. The fact that they triggered the crisis of the WTO dispute settlement system made us all sit down, yeah, and start thinking of, yes, so how do we get going again? There have been discussion papers on WTO reform, and you're undoubtedly familiar with them. September, the concept paper of the European Commission of September 2018, and the same month Canada came out with its proposals on the modernization of the WTO. China came out with a very elaborate paper in April or May 2019. And there have been a few other efforts that have received less attention. There have also been specific proposals and draft decisions on a number of issues. And this is not a complete list. On notification requirements. Which is actually an initiative by the United States, but also by the European Union, by Japan, and even 1 or 2 developing countries to strengthen the notification requirements. And very controversially, these proposals would actually provide for sanctions to developing, well, to members, not necessarily developing countries, but they're the ones that have most problems with the notification requirements, to countries that fail to notify, eventually leading to getting the status of an inactive member, which means that your diplomats cannot be appointed to be chair of a committee, or that you have not a right to get a response to questions that you would ask in the context of trade review. Trade policy review proceedings, and so on. Yeah? This, of course, triggered huge criticism from the countries that felt addressed, developing countries, saying that it was not a question of bad will, but that it was a question of capacity. Well, let me, now that I can speak freely, now that I'm no longer a judge, let me say the following about this. If you can send a spacecraft to look at the dark side of the moon, yeah, as China did, or if you can almost land, at the very last minute it went wrong, if you can land the spacecraft on the moon, surely you can notify measures to the WTO Secretariat. Yeah? This is not really serious. Now, mind you, if you talk about notification of measures, China, for example, will say, well, this measure is not a subsidy measure, therefore it does not need to be notified. Yeah? So the discussion may be on also on that level, that some measures just don't need to be. Special and differential treatment. Obviously, you know that the United States challenges the self-determination, the self-selection of countries, WTO members, as developing countries, and therefore benefiting from special and differential treatment. Their proposal on the table is a very, very radical one. Yeah? I'm not going to go through the list of 4 criteria, but it basically means that India would no longer be a developing country. Yeah? One could debate about China, or at least certain aspects of their industry, but India, even if they almost landed a craft on the moon, I think some of you are from India. You can. I've been there frequently. India still is a developing country. Yeah? But the mere fact that there would be G20 would exclude them from that. And perhaps also they're sharing world trade. That's another criteria. The subsidy disciplines. There's a specific proposal by the US, the European Union, and Japan on reforming the disciplines under the SCM and cover. What hurts me in that one, if I may say so, now that I have the opportunity, what hurts me is that the European Union signed on that agreement, which also has as one of its elements to change the case law of the appellate body on public body. Well, I wish the negotiators luck to come up with another definition of public body that is not what the United States wants. Okay, and then finally, specific proposals on the functioning of the appellate body. We'll come back to that on the next slide. Now, let me briefly go into, not in detail, but let me briefly talk a bit about the reform of the negotiating function, the reform of the monitoring function, and the reform of the dispute settlement function. And I have only a slide of one on each of them. So I'm very, very, very condensed. In terms of the reform of the negotiating function, I think we all agree, or at least I hope we all agree, that there is a need for new rules addressing 21st century trade problems. First of all, we need new adapted rules on market distorting government support channeled through state-owned enterprises. Actually, already in September 2018, the European Commission said that this was an issue that had to be negotiated urgently. That this was on the top of should be on the top of the negotiating agenda. Integrating the Chinese model in the global trading system is a challenge, and that challenge has to be addressed. Yes, we need to talk about that. And as I already said, the US, Japan, and the EU have sort of first proposal on the table in that sense, which will not be acceptable to China, but you have to start negotiations somewhere. Secondly, we need rules on digital trade, on e-commerce. Unfortunately, their negotiations have started. Negotiations which involve both the US and China, but they could not be further apart than they are in terms of what they think is important in such an agreement. This will be difficult negotiations, but necessary negotiations. Third, we need new rules assuring that trade will contribute to the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that is a very broad package of new rules that we will need. But there is, again, there are, at this very moment, there are negotiations on at least one of these new rules, and these are the fishery subsidies rules. These negotiations are difficult. They're more difficult than people expected them to be. We thought that we would be much further advanced. I'm actually very proud to say that one of my former students is now chairing these negotiations as the ambassador of Colombia. That's the advantage if you get old. Yeah? But, right. Yeah, we also need to learn from the current crisis. Yeah, and we need better rules. We need rules to better address future pandemics or other crises. I think we talked briefly about the export prohibitions, the export restrictions. Listen, these all had a legal basis in current WTO law. But are they the most rational response to a crisis? No. Yeah? And so better rules would actually more go in the direction of freeing trade completely in such crisis moments than preventing trade, preventing exports. Does this sound idealistic? Perhaps, but it is from a policy perspective the best response, because we're unlikely to be all at the same time on the same peak of the crisis. So when the crisis hits most in Asia, Europe and the United States are probably still able to produce and can export to. When the crisis is going down in Asia, Asia can then export to where the crisis then subsequently hits. And we've seen that. We've seen that in the COVID crisis. So I think we need to also negotiate better rules there. And then finally, we need rules on developing country status and effective, and I wish I had been able to underline effective special and differential treatment. It doesn't fly anymore. And now I'm speaking not on behalf, but as a developed country person. It doesn't. Brazil is not India. India is not China. They have different levels of economic development, and you cannot put all of these developing countries, certainly not the emerging economies, under the same umbrella. Yeah? I mean, even Korea and Mexico still officially consider themselves to be developing countries. Now they're not invoking, at least that's what they promised now, they're not invoking special and differential treatment anymore, but they still consider themselves developing countries. We need rules on developing country status, and those rules and this differentiation between countries on the basis of the level of their development will also allow to give more preferential treatment, more special and differential treatment to those developing countries that really need it. Now, so that's my wish list, or more than a wish list. I mean, that's my list of new rules that I think we need. Your list may be longer or may have other elements in it, but the real question is, how do we negotiate these rules? And I don't have a magic solution, but I see three possibilities. One is multilateral negotiations leading to a multilateral agreement. Fishery subsidies negotiations are on that line. Then we have the possibility of negotiating plurilaterally, leading to plurilateral agreements, but plurilateral agreements of which the benefits will be applied on a most favored nation treatment basis. Yeah? So, meaning that also the non-parties to that plurilateral WTO agreement would benefit from it. Have we been able to do that in the past? Yes, we've been able to do that. For example, the Information Technology Agreement is such a plurilateral agreement, the benefits of which are to all WTO members. Why are you able to do that? Because the parties to that agreement constitute a critical mass. Let's hope that the negotiations on the digital trade, on a digital trade agreement go that way. Problem in that context is that currently India is still not participating in these negotiations on digital trade. And then finally, and that's a bit of a nightmare scenario for multilateralists as I am, but finally, you may have to go to plurilateral agreements that will not be applied on a most favored nation basis. Yeah? But as you all know, that is very much against the basic philosophy of a multilateral trading system. So let's hope for the best in this sense. And the best for me is, the best you can realistically hope for is probably a plurilateral agreements applied on a most favored nation basis. Right, so that's for the negotiating function. For the monitoring function, well, an audience like this, I do not have to stress the importance of transparency. Yeah? What's probably a much bigger trade barrier than customs duties is the inability to know what laws will be applied to your imports. Yeah? What the legal regime is of the country that you export to. So transparency is of the utmost importance. And monitoring of the trade legislation, the trade rules, the trade policy of other countries goes with that assuring of transparency. Yeah? You need monitoring too. So which improvements are needed in that respect? Well, first of all, and I already referred to it, there is a need to give more incentives, but perhaps a carrot should never come without a stick. Also, sanctions to improve compliance with notification requirements. Secondly, I think we need to take the TBT committee and the SPS committee as an example for other WTO committees. These two committees have been quite effective in monitoring national trade policies and measures, have been quite effective in addressing concerns that WTO members had with regard to SPS measures or TBT measures adopted by their trading partners. And they were then discussed in the context of either the TBT committee or the SPS committee. And in a number of cases, solutions were found. So I think other WTO committees should learn from that experience. Yeah? And the role of these committees should be increased. And then finally, I think there's still room to strengthen the trade policy review mechanism, which I always describe to my students as this jewel in hiding. This jewel that is not really known to many people outside the trade community. The trade policy review is a wonderful thing, but it can still be strengthened, and it should be. Okay, quickly going through the dispute settlement function, and I have to constrain myself to be fast here because I can talk forever on this. As you know, the US has been voicing concerns, and that I put between inverted commas because it's a word that doesn't cover the reality. Concerns regarding the functioning of the appellate body. Now, the Trump administration correctly points out that with the exception of their concern relating to Rule 15 of the working procedures, that all these other concerns have been raised by the Obama and even by the Bush Jr. administration. That's correct. Yeah? The only difference is that the United States thought it to be proper to undermine the whole system in order to be heard on those concerns. What are these concerns? Well, in the first place, judicial overreach, which is a bit of a catch-all term for judicial activism, for considering your, that's the accusation, that the appellate body considers its case law as having as being binding precedent, the accusation of the appellate body rendering advisory opinions, meaning deciding on things that don't need to be decided, and then finally the appellate body reviewing factual findings, and in particular the findings on the meaning of domestic law. That's judicial overreach. Yeah? Many of these things, and especially judicial activism, in my mind, are very much in the eye of the beholder. Yeah? I've never had a party complain about the appellate body being guilty of judicial activism, also not the United States, when the appellate body agreed with their position. Yeah? So when you agree with a party, there's no judicial activism. The moment that you don't agree with them, some of them continue to cry out that this is an instance of judicial activism. With regard to, yeah, let me say that one too, can't resist. With regard to binding precedent, if the appellate body had ruled that, or once it would rule, if it ever had that opportunity again, that zeroing is in fact consistent with the anti-dumping agreement's provisions, I think the United States would be the very first to insist that that appellate body ruling would be applied by all subsequent panels and subsequent appellate body divisions that would have to look. They would cry out for there to be precedent. Yeah. The other thing that is, or the other group of concerns of the United States is disregard for procedural and institutional rules. And the one that, of course, stands out here is the 90-day time frame, mandatory time frame for appellate review, which the United States says you cannot go beyond the 90-day unless you have the authorization of the parties. And there are people that do not understand why the appellate body in 2010 stopped asking for the authorization of the parties. Now, let me spend one line on this. Yeah? If you ask the parties authorization to go beyond the 90 days, you actually give the appellee, the party that is pretty happy with the panel report, you give it the possibility to frustrate the right of appeal of the appellant. Yeah. Just think of a case such as PC Airbus. Yeah, it takes the panel 5 years. It came in its first time, 5 years to get its panel report out. Well, the United States was pretty happy with that report. Yeah? So if the United States at that moment would have said, no, 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 we want the European Union, sorry, we want the appellate body to do this case in 90 days, the mandatory 90 days, what would the appellate body then have been able to do? That would have been a very, very, very superficial, truncated review of that panel report. That would not have been serious. I can tell you that I would have refused to sit on a case like that. So now, the United States, oh no, 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 but in such a case, we would always agree to an extended time frame. Well, now you started, how much of an extended time frame? Anyway, I wanted to. Now, there have been, I already referred to that, there have been multiple proposals by WTO members, not by the United States, but by other members that were concerned about the possible consequences of a paralysis of the appellate body because there was no appointment anymore of appellate body members. And throughout 2019, late 2018, throughout much of 2019, many WTO members tabled either in group or individually proposals for addressing.
Peter, I'm extremely sorry, but we are on timing here, and we are should be starting the panel 1 now. So if you could please wrap up.
I'll finish very quickly.
Yes, sorry.
No. Thank you for pointing that out. So there was a draft decision. All these proposals were taken by the Walker Commission. The Walker Commission then, Walker Commission, not Walker, Ambassador Walker put this in a draft General Council decision, and that General Council decision was was immediately rejected by the United States. Where do we stand now in dispute settlement? Well, there's the multi-party interim appeal arbitration arrangement that has been active. It's now active among 23 WTO members, but including the five of the 10 most frequent users of the system. Coming to the conclusion and answering the question up front, when we ask ourselves the question whether the WTO or the WTO or the multilateral trading system will survive these various crises, we have to be, first of all, we have to be realistic. We have to think of the current crisis of the WTO and the multilateral trading system as part of a much wider crisis of multilateralism, and put it in the context of the re-emergence of superpower confrontation. That's point one. Point two is we will see in the years to come, it doesn't please me at all to say that, but that's the reality, we will see increased insecurity and unpredictability in international trade relations. But three, there is an existential need, and that need will not go away, for international cooperation on trade and international regulation of trade. And what does this mean? This means that, not my generation anymore, we blew it, but the generation of many of those listening now, you'll have to search for a new consensus on the balance between trade and other societal values and interests, and you'll have to focus on institutional reform and reconstruction. But there is, to my mind, no alternative or alternatives to the or a WTO or multilateral trading system. And I'd like to conclude with the following thought. And it was not said about the WTO or about the GATT, but it was said about the UN, United Nations. But I think it is true also for the WTO and multilateral trading system. And we should keep this in mind, or you should keep it in mind in your efforts to re-establish the system. UN think the WTO, multilateral trading system, is not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And with that, I conclude and I apologize for going over time.
Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you, Jana, and thank you very much, Professor Bosch. You have beautifully, with a huge clarity and great enthusiasm, summarized the key challenges, the key crisis situations we are facing right now. And you have, most importantly, shown us the way ahead. You have shown us what reforms need to happen, because for a long time we have all been engaged in discussions of challenges and crises. And this is such a food for thought to begin this conference, which is titled as a 3R initiative, because you have shown us how and what changes are required to rethink, to rescue, and to repackage the multilateral trading system. Thank you for being a part of this conference. We are very pleased. We could not be happier having you start this conference with this brilliant keynote speech. And from here on, we will invite you, if your time allows, whenever it allows, to participate in the next 3 excellent panels we are moving into. Thank you, Professor Bosch. We could not have been happier. And this conference is already a big success with this most brilliant and most enlightening speech. Thank you very much.
You're very, very kind. And all the things that I've been saying are on your dish. Huh? It's for you people to do it. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend the rest of the conference because I had a prior commitment, but I'm sure that I see that it's being recorded, so I will definitely go back to some of the panels later on. Thank you very much, and best wishes.
Thank